Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shireen Salzer, and I'm the coordinator of these grand rounds and the one who sends you those emails that hopefully you all enjoy receiving. I'm excited to tell you that we're going to be joining the 21st century and finally moving towards electronic evaluations. Now, you all saw that you have paper evaluations out there this time because we're just kind of doing a pilot, and those faculty that I work with here at Laurelhurst will find that they have an email already in their inbox, which gives them a link for doing the evaluation this time. If you have a iPad, any kind of tablet, that should work. They should work with phones by the time we do a full rollout in February. We're doing this because we need to keep up with the increased documentation to keep our Category 1 CME accreditation, and so that we can accommodate tracking the CE credits of our growing audience and provide certification when you guys need it. Which reminds me, we're going to be skipping January. I've already had a couple of people say, there's no January on the schedule. So we all get to have a holiday, and so February is when we will be rolling this out in full. Now, I get to work with two wonderful women who actually find the speakers and convince them to come and share their expertise and time with us. And that's Dr. Ann Vanderstoep and Dr. Carol Rockhill. And so right now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ann Vanderstoep. Thank you.
And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is child psychiatrist and child psychiatric epidemiologist, Adrian Angold. Adrian received his medical, psychiatric, and research training at Bethlehem Royal and Maudsley Hospitals, as well as the Institute of Psychiatry in London. He was actually born in London as well. Reflecting his early and abiding interest in child and adolescent depression, he led the development of two widely used measures, the CAPA, the Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Assessment, and the Mood and Feelings Questionnaire. Let's just give Adrian a show of hands. How many of us use one or more of those instruments? Okay, look at that, Adrian, there you are.
You must be mad.
Don't tell us the backstory.
I know the only reason they use the MSQ is because it's free.
Well, there is that. But it's also, according to your paper in 1988, the best.
Oh, well, there is that.
Okay. In 1988, speaking of, he and his research/domestic partner, Jane Costello, moved to the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke, where they founded the Developmental Epidemiology program. And in the early 90s, they began work on the Great Smoky Mountains study. This cohort study has served as a platform for many seminal papers that have contributed in major ways to our understanding of children and their mental health. Last year, Adrian took on the mantle of director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship at Duke. Interim. Anyway, it probably is a full job anyway, regardless of whether it's interim. Now, most people in this group see Adrian, if they've seen him, at meetings. How many of you have seen Adrian at ACAP, for example? Okay, number of you. SRCD, Research in Child Development, all right. I see him at the American Public Health Association, the Life History Research Meeting, and most importantly, the International Society for Research in Child and Adolescent Psychopathology. How many people here are members of ISRCAP? Okay, so this year, Adrian, and next year, Adrian is the president of the ISRCAP organization. In fact, because he's British, we call him the king of ISRCAP. He has recently shifted his research focus to preschoolers. He and Helen Egger worked together to develop the PAPA, or the preschool age psychiatric assessment, and he's particularly interested in young children with anxiety disorders. It is anxiety disorders in children, adolescents, and young adults about which he will speak to us today. Would you please join me in giving Dr. Adrian Angold a warm welcome?
Well, I've known Anne for a long time, since we both share an interest in epidemiology. But it turns out that I've known your chair even longer, because he just came up and introduced himself to me and says he remembers my party when I left the Institute of Psychiatry. Apparently, I was too drunk to remember him. But so he's probably the person I've known longest in the room. Fortunately, I'm sober this morning, and so I'll remember all of you. So I want to talk about the psychopathology of anxiety disorders in children and young people from a variety of perspectives. And my key point, I may as well make it at the beginning, is that from what we have previously known, I'm fairly certain that we've been massively underestimating both the early ages of onset of many of these anxiety disorders, and also the degree to which, even at the youngest ages, they really are a significant clinical problem. And one of my messages is going to be that our whole child and adolescent and adult service system is completely upside down, in that if we just take child psychiatry, who do we typically see? The big part the biggest part is probably most services is adolescents with conduct problems on the one hand, and kids with ADHD on the other hand. And we typically don't see them till they've had those disorders for years and years and years and years and years and years. What I want to suggest to you here, and how often do we see preschoolers? Almost never. How often do pediatricians refer preschoolers? Almost never. That's a tiny part of what we actually do clinically. And one of the messages that I'm going to hope you all get out of the talk that I'm going to give is that maybe we've got this, we should think about turning this on its head. So let's see if I can work the electronics. First, I better say I haven't got any conflicts of interest. I'm an epidemiologist. Drug companies have absolutely no interest whatsoever in epidemiology. So I simply have to declare that thank you very much to NIMH, NIDA, the Lowenstein Foundation, and NARSAD for funding for our work over many years. My daughter is a costume jewelry designer, and I'm the proud owner of a 19% share in Sarah Angold's studio. I suggest you all go to sarahangold.com. It's coming up to Christmas. Now is the time when you want to buy your loved ones something beautiful to remember you by. And I must also say thanks to Jane Costello, who Anne mentioned, who at the time was my partner. Now, actually, for the last number of years, has been my wife. And everything you see here involves her in one way or another. Secondly, Helen Egger, who I first met when she was a PGY2 and has been working with us since then, and now is my division chief. So, and Bill Copeland, as associate professor, who has also contributed a lot of the work that you will see here. All right. So, what do we know about ages of onset of anxiety disorders? Well, the answer is actually not very much. In fact, when the best sort of epidemiological population level data that I think I can find is actually from the National Comorbidity Survey. And this is from the National Comorbidity Survey replication. Now, you'll probably all remember that every time they repeat the NCS, for depression, they produce that graph of ages of onset, showing that younger cohorts are having earlier ages of onset and higher rates. But they only do that for depression, trying to find out, okay, what are the estimated ages of onset for anxiety disorders turns out to be somewhat more difficult. And this is the best that I can find. What they're presenting here is the age of onset of selected percentiles of people who have had the disorder. So what this says, that the median person with panic disorder had an onset at age 24. So what this, now, what you've got to recognize here is that all of these adult studies have been based on retrospective recall from people who are, anywhere between 18 and, I'm not quite sure even what the top end is, but 80 maybe. 75? 55. So what you're asking people to do, if these genuinely are early onset disorders, is to remember, anything back to 50 or more years back in their life, to say, well, did I have this when I was 2 or 3? And we all know that recall of very early, I know that my earliest memory was at age 2.5. And so, but what if you've got a disorder at 2? We're not expecting that people would necessarily going to be remembering this very well. So this whole retrospective recall approach, I think, is a real problem if you really want to understand the development of disorders. But we can do some sums from this due to mathematical genius. So what I figured out from that previous table is that what this shows is this is the disorder. This is what the NCS says is the median age for onset of the disorder. And so this, given the overall lifetime rate by age 75, we can compute that at the 50th percentile age, half of the people will have had their disorder, which predicts that at age 24, about 3% of people should have that disorder. Then we've got cumulative prevalences from the Great Smoky Mountains study. So what we took was a bunch of 9, 11, and 13-year-olds in like 1993, and we've been following them up ever since, and we've got up to 11 waves of data giving 3-month prevalences on all of these kids. At each wave, we got at least an 80% follow-up rate, and the median number of interviews completed by our subjects is now 8. So we've actually managed to keep fairly good levels of follow-up going over time. And then all we do is we say, how many of these kids have ever, at any point over those 8 to 11 interviews, met criteria for a diagnosis of panic disorder? And what you can see is that this is what the predicted prevalence from the National Comorbidity Survey, and what you can find is that by age 26, which is fairly close to 24, 4.8% of people have already met criteria for the diagnosis of panic disorder. We look at agoraphobia. The NCS prevalence says there should be hardly any, and we're finding that at least 6.1% of kids have already met criteria for agoraphobia. If you look at generalized anxiety disorder, you see a very similar pattern, that we've got twice as many people who've, looking prospectively, have had the diagnosis. We look at separation anxiety disorder. Well, the median age of onset is roughly what you'd expect, but we've got about twice the rate by the age of 26, and really all of the diagnoses of separation anxiety disorder in the NCS are all over and done with by about 18. So we wouldn't. I think there still is an underestimation going on here. Separation anxiety disorder, similarly. Social phobia, we're actually saying, well, there's actually an overestimate of the earliness of onset of social phobia. That's an extremely unfortunate way of putting it. It's an underestimate. And for specific phobias, we're finding a much lower prevalence. I think this. I'm not going to talk much more about specific phobias, but I'm pretty certain that this is due to the fact that the way we assess specific phobias, we require a great deal more in the way of impairment than the CD does. So I think we can't say much about what this means because it's really a methodological phenomenon, and probably, so it's a wash. All right, so that's suggesting to me, just at the outset, that the numbers we're expecting from adult retrospective surveys for ages of onset are probably substantially skewed in the direction of underestimating earliness, which is not so surprising given that tons of research on recall has shown that there's a tendency to bring things forward in time. That if something happened 10 years ago, you remember it as happening 7 years ago. And I mean, that's been documented, a million times. And so it's not surprising that you should see this. On the other hand, it does underemphasize, I think, the importance of our role in I keep pressing the wrong button, when, the literature's telling us, we're never going to see agoraphobia in children and adolescents, whereas in reality, it's really quite common. So that's point number one. What's more, remember, we started this study with cohorts of 9, 11, and 13-year-olds, 1,400 of them. And we're only asking them about the preceding 3 months. We're not asking them about lifetime. We're just saying in the last 3 months, which means these numbers can only be underestimates. So the difference is probably even greater than is shown here. And in the little next section, I'm going to talk to you about some evidence about why we really believe that's true. But first of all, just out of interest, what do you reckon by age 26 the cumulative prevalence of having had a psychiatric disorder, the DSM-4 diagnosed psychiatric disorder, by the age of 26 is? Meeting full criteria. Somebody's got to shout out a number. I'm just going to stand here until somebody does. Okay, 60%. The majority of people by the age of 26 have met criteria for a full criteria DSM-4 psychiatric disorder. What if we put in NOS? 80%. Okay, that's it's about 80% of people. And we've written this up, and it's the argument that we make is, well, medical illnesses are normative. Everybody, 100% of people have had some medical illness by the time they're 26. Now, so these are not all killer disorders. Some, people have them, and maybe a few months later they recover. But I don't know anywhere else in medicine where people go, oh, you've got the flu. So what? It's a self-limiting disorder. We have huge programs of vaccination. We're trying to vaccinate everybody in the world against the flu. And then there's been, years of actually rather unsuccessful research trying to actually treat it. But just because it's a self-limiting disorder in the rest of medicine doesn't mean that we just go, oh, who cares? We actually make efforts to do something about it. And these are, we all know as child psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers that these are severely disabling disorders. Even if they aren't disabling, they're very painful. They're painful for the children themselves, they're painful for their parents, their families, and their schools, and their preschools. And I don't know any other branch of medicine that just sort of goes, oh, well, they'll grow out of it. Or if it doesn't last the whole of their lives, it doesn't matter. As far as I'm concerned, these things do matter. So I've also argued that I think these are underestimates, and I want to present you with some evidence that even what we've got in the GSMS is an underestimate. Because anxiety in young children has tended to be regarded as normative. Okay, if you're 2, you get scared of all sorts of things, so it probably doesn't mean anything. If you're little kids are scaredy cats. And in fact, if little kids aren't sufficiently scaredy cat, we get worried about them because they'll run out into the road and get knocked down and they'll get lost and blah, blah, blah. The extremes, however, there's a big variation. Some kids are much more scaredy cat than other kids are. And so there has been, but that's been seen not under the aegis of psychiatric disorder. It's been considered under the aegis of temperament. And despite the fact that Stella Chess was a child psychiatrist, Thomas and Chess were both psychiatrists, that sort of the whole temperament field has kind of been largely co-opted by clinical psychology. I'm not blaming anybody about that. I'm not saying it's wicked of them. I think they've done a lot of really good work. But what that's meant is that there's been a certain amount of resistance to wanting to use the sort of categorical diagnoses that we use for older kids in the rest of psychiatry. So behavioral inhibition is one of the key temperamental constructs that there's been a lot of research about. And the idea is that there are dispositional states of individuals called temperaments, which are risk factors for having later psychiatric disorders. And so 15% of young children show this pattern of intense and persistent fear, shyness, social withdrawal in response to unfamiliar situations or people. Why 15%? Go on, have a guess. Because that's the definition. It's defined as the top 15%. It actually, it's not, there's no magical cut point that says 15% is the right point. It's the people who, began doing this work in the 70s, decided that, we think the top 15% is the right size group for us to be considering. So when people say 15% of kids have behavioral inhibition, all that means is that it's like, what percent of kids are above the 90th percentile on the CBCL? Oh, could it be 10%? It's exact. Though I have actually, reviewing a paper, actually once seen a paper where someone said, and 10% of the kids are above the 90th percentile on the CBCL. I was like, yes, thank you. Now, but there isn't any doubt that this pattern of withdrawal is associated with later anxiety disorders and in later childhood, particularly social phobia, separation anxiety disorder, and I guess this is all a child audience, right? So I don't need to say, to us, that means separation anxiety disorder, not seasonal affective disorder, and agoraphobia, and high rates of depression in adulthood. All of which makes sense in terms of the later childhood anxiety, depression, etc., predictive relationships. Since there's good evidence that, generalized anxiety disorder predicts depression and depression predicts generalized anxiety disorder. Just as a side note, there was for a while the idea that GAD was the early form of depression, that it was like a childhood form of depression, and that the line of prediction should go from GAD to depression. So childhood GAD, adolescent and adult depression, and that the opposite way, depression to GAD, should be much smaller because this was a developmental progression. 3 population studies have now looked at that in detail, and all 3 of them show that that's not true, that the back and forth is roughly equal from GAD to depression and depression to GAD, that these are sort of alternating forms rather than developmentally differentiated manifestations of a single disorder. So, okay, behavioral inhibition, a temperament, has been seen as a risk factor. But just look at this. Intense and persistent fear, shyness, and social withdrawal in response to unfamiliar people, situations, or objects. Does that sound like anything to you that we have in our stupid DSM-4 book? Yes, it sounds a bit like social phobia. So alternatively, why shouldn't we say, well, maybe it's not a risk for a later anxiety disorder. What we're picking up here is an alternative name coming from, as it were, the clinical psychology tradition for what we would otherwise be calling an anxiety disorder. And so that was a question that we have been, particularly Helen and I, have been very interested in. And so we thought we'd better to have a bit of a look at that. Now I'm pressing the wrong button. And so I want to just briefly mention some of the work in our preschool anxiety studies, which we've been doing for the last few years. So we screened in pediatric primary care 3,400 and odd kids using the bunch of anxiety items from the child behavior checklist, which we had previously shown actually did predict actually meeting criteria for anxiety disorders, at least in a useful way, enough for it to be useful to screen rather than just doing interviews on everyone, since doing interviews on everyone is very, very, very expensive. So we screened 3,400, interviewed 917. Those 917 were all the people who scored in the top quartile on the screen, and a 7% sample of lower scorers. Within that, there was a nested case control study where we took half of them. We took all the anxiety disorders. There were like 254 kids who met criteria for an anxiety disorder, and then we took a random sample of about the same number of non-anxious kids, and then we took a bunch of them, and at sort of when they reach the age of 5, and here's a tip. Not very many people, do fMRI studies with kids this young. If you're thinking of doing it, forget 4.5-year-old boys. Something happens to 4.5-year-old boys that they cannot do it. We want to see how far down we could go. And it's like, okay, when they're very little, you can let them, well, not for fMRI, but for certain sorts of MRI, you can let them go to sleep. And you can even, probably do, as long as you've got a very short paradigm, you can probably do fMRI as well. But even in boys. But when they hit 4.5, they cannot. Any of them. We tried this, we were going to do a pilot study where we were going to do 16 or whatever, just to see. When the first 8 had all been just hopeless, movement artifact up the wazoo. You couldn't even get close to using the data. We decided we're really wasting our time here. So just a tip, don't go down below 5. Now, this is just to say, okay, so how well can you do this? These kids are like aged 5 to 10. They're doing like a 45-minute fMRI paradigm, but with an anatomical and DTI, diffusion tensor imaging. The reason this one is small is we didn't start doing resting state until the end. This is a study where we're trying to, scan them up multiple times. And this is just actually to say, these figures are really not very different from what you get with getting usable data out of substantially older kids. You have to do some special magical things to actually manage to get them through the whole fMRI. So we've discovered you have to have somebody in the scanner room with them. That person has to have their hand on their, on their leg or something like that, just so they can feel that there's somebody present. So you have to do a fair amount of work in the mock scanner beforehand, and we have this whole mock scanner paradigm where they go through and they have a little book that they fill in that's all about the mock scanner, and then they go and see the mock scanner, and they get in the mock scanner, and they have all this, play them all the noises that they're going to hear. And if and we also have a sort of training thing, so that if they're watching a video, and if they move too much, the video goes off. So to sort of train them to how to keep still. Anyway, so we do all of those things, and of course, if they can't get to a certain criterion in the mock scanner, then we're not even going to waste the $400 it costs to put them in the real scanner. But what this is to show is that with these younger kids, we actually got reasonably high levels, even for a long 45-minute fMRI paradigm. We can really achieve quite reasonable success. We haven't finished scan 3 yet, so that's why it's as low as it is. Anyway, so that's just a bit. We're rather proud of that. So that's just the basic outline of the study. So the first question is, if we just treat preschoolers as we would older kids, and we say, now, you obviously can't directly do a DSM-4 structured interview with a 2-year-old. You know, it isn't going to work. So we just do the interview with the parents, and we do a whole bunch of observations and with the kids. But so this Prevalence is based on parent report on the preschool age psychiatric assessment, which is, of course, the best assessment of preschool age disorders that there is. Of course, we invented it, and this is taking a whole bunch of, like, about 30 studies in 8 to 17-year-olds, and taking the median rate for each of these disorders from that from. It's not a formal meta-analysis. We're just taking the median rate. Studies from 1993 up till now. So that's the dirty greenish-oyed colored bars. And what you can see is that the rates of these disorders, specific phobia, social, generalized anxiety, separation anxiety, are extremely similar already in 2 to 5-year-olds to the rates that you're going to see in later childhood and adolescence. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, these are not very different from the rates that you're going to see in adults as well. So already by age 2 to 5, we can diagnose kids with these disorders using exactly the same criteria as we would in adults. There's 2 points to note about that. Those who object, everybody will get the diagnosis because, of course, little kids are scaredy cats. That's not true. If you require impairment and whatever, just like you would for diagnosis at any other time, and you do a good job of taking the history, everybody doesn't get an anxiety diagnosis. The vast majority of people do not get an anxiety diagnosis in the last 3 months, but quite strikingly, pretty much the same number do, as will much later in life. So that seems to me to be quite strong evidence that, in fact, these are real disorders that we should be taking seriously. And we're not just dealing with a tendency to be going to develop a disorder. We're actually developing these disorders now. And another little thing to say is I think that the temperament and psychopathology issues have got very muddled in that temperament is supposed to be this genetic, highly stable set of characteristics of individual kids. But if you do a comparison of twin studies, if you do twin studies, what you find is the genetic loadings for temperament are no different from the genetic loadings for psychiatric disorder. If you look at the test-retest reliability over the short term or over 1 or 2 years, the test-retest reliability of temperament scales is, if anything, slightly lower and the test-retest reliability of the child behavior checklist. So on these key parameters where temperament and psychopathology are supposed to be, conceptually different from one another, the only real difference that I can see is that, of course, temperament has a positive side, whereas psychopathology deals only with negative. So I think we can think about these either way, but from the perspective of selling the story, it seems to me, we're in a much better position saying kids have got psychiatric disorders that are treatable than we are saying they've got negative temperaments, because negative temperaments are supposed to be these fixed characteristics. And so it doesn't, also, that's not an argument that's going to get you anywhere with your state authorities or with the NIMH or It's like they want illnesses. So what I'm suggesting is we can certainly say that these are disabling, problematic illnesses that don't just disappear. So the second thing is that people have been very bothered that, can we really, there's supposed to be all this comorbidity between the different diagnoses and blah, blah, blah. And people have suggested, even my old boss, Mike Russer, said that what's the point of distinguishing among the child anxiety disorders? That we should just have one overall clump of childhood anxiety disorders because they're not really discriminable. And it grieves me to say it, he lied through his teeth. But I'm afraid that Mike's completely wrong about that. And that's really what the rest of this talk is going to be about. Don't tell him I said so. So here, just because any good talk these days needs to have some brain pictures in it. And just to show that we're keeping up with the times. And it's actually been really interesting being an epidemiologist for 25 years, because we are doing stuff now with our data that we collected way back when. You'll see more of this in relation to the Great Smoky Mountains study when I get to it, that we could not even have imagined doing when we started the studies. When we started the Great Smoky Mountains study, this technology did not exist. We're doing genome-wide association studies. They didn't exist. We've currently got grants in to do epigenetic studies, whole genome methylation. That didn't exist when we started this work. But we collected all these blood samples, from these kids developmentally over time. And it's now like, whoa, what a resource for things we never could have imagined. So I know most people aren't epidemiologists, but epidemiology these days is, you can forget writing a grant that says, we want to know how many people have X, Y, or just X, Y, or Z. That's not where it's at. It's all about how can we bring this to mechanism. And the strength of the epidemiological approach is that we consider the ill population in relation to the general population, and we're able to make estimates of risk and whatever that refer to the whole population. But we can now use all these technologies on top of that. So I think that now is a really good time to be an epidemiologist. And I just wish that I was starting now instead of when I did start. But anyway, be that as it may, that's just a plug for my discipline, which I know most people don't find very interesting. All right, so here we're looking at functional connectivity. This is following up kids who 2 to 4 years before had an anxiety disorder, controlling for their current anxiety symptoms. So this is looking for state markers of having, at a previous point, had an anxiety disorder, controlling for your current anxiety symptoms. And the key point here is that what we see in relation to generalized anxiety, social phobia, and separation anxiety disorder is 3 completely different patterns of connectivity. For the purposes of this talk, I don't mean to go into exactly what, exactly what we think all of this means, I just want to say, when you see patterns like this, why would you want to lump the anxiety disorders together? If you're already seeing, what's more, these are changes that are, as it were, markers of having had the disorder 2 to 4 years before. Now, whether they're scars or whether they predated the disorders themselves, we don't know. But I think this sort of evidence is very convincing to me that we're talking about different things, because what you can see is in the different disorders we've got changes in relation to different sorts of faces. So fearful faces in GAD, angry faces in social phobia, and also angry faces in separation anxiety, but indeed that turns into a positive association. You expect a negative association between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, because this idea is that the activity in the prefrontal cortex is down-regulating activity in the amygdala. So the amygdala goes, "Ah!" And your prefrontal cortex says, no, calm down. So the more prefrontal you've got, the less amygdala. So there's a negative correlation. So that, and what's happening is that negative correlation is being decreased. So it's like the amygdala goes, "Ah!" and the prefrontal cortex doesn't do enough saying, calm down, or it's overwhelmed by the size of the R. And in fact, in the separation anxiety disorder, this is not very well expressed, because what actually happens is it's the same pattern, but it's so substantial that in fact it goes from a negative correlation to a positive correlation. So I think that means from the earliest days, there are important ways in which these disorders are different from one another at the neurobiological level. And I'm now going to switch to looking at development across puberty, and I hope to show that they continue to be differentiated throughout the course of development. All right. So what if we take the position that, one anxiety disorder is the same as another anxiety disorder, and we look from age 9 to age 26 at the prevalence of any anxiety disorder at those ages? This is what we see, a U-shaped curve. It looks like it's really good to be 12. If only we could all be 12, we'd be happy. I have to say, I don't remember this at 12. When I was 12, I was up here somewhere. But anyway, so there's a very strange curve. That's a sort of unusual type of developmental curve. But that's what you see. And a very large number of studies of anxiety disorders in children take the approach of lumping the anxiety disorders together and say, what predicts anxiety disorders across the whole range of anxiety disorders. I want to show you why this is a mistake. But first of all, let me remind you about one of the 3 best-known findings in child and adolescent psychiatry. At the age of 13 to 14, rates of depression double or triple in females, and they stay higher than in males. Males stay the same, and they stay higher in females throughout the reproductive lifespan. Right? Everybody knows that. The other 2 most important truths in child psychiatry I cannot reveal to you, because you can only be allowed to know those when you've got the secret child psychiatrist handshake. But this has been replicated 1 billion times. This is just true. So we're going to do a bit of comparison between depression and anxiety disorders, because we've got some idea. So just bear that in mind. So here's specific phobias. They're really fairly flat. And as I say, because we have very high bar for diagnosing specific phobias, they're pretty uncommon. Here's social phobia, oh, it's going up in girls at 13 to 14, a bit like depression does. Here's generalized anxiety disorder. It's showing a rather similar pattern to depression. What on earth this is, I have no idea. I hope that goes back down again next time, but because it's like, what? Anyway, but even so, the girls are still higher. But that's a pattern that looks very much like the depression pattern. And here's separation anxiety disorder, which basically, the reason that these lines don't spread out is that we decided after age 16 there wasn't really any point in spending 10 minutes asking all these questions. Now, this may be partly artifactual, because those of you who do follow the National Comorbidity Survey will know they did the quite intelligent thing of thinking, what would separation anxiety disorder be like if you were 30? Clearly you wouldn't be grabbing onto the hem of your mother's skirt. You wouldn't be doing this. So they came up with a version of separation anxiety disorder, which is much more about, feeling anxious when you haven't got, when your wife isn't there, feeling, scared about going out to things unless you've got, somebody really well accompanying you, and blah, blah, blah. And if you take that approach, then actually you come up with a rate of about 2 or 3% in adulthood. So it could be argued, and that, this is still a matter for debate. Is that really the same thing? My guess is actually I believe it, but that if you take the standard separation anxiety criteria, this is what happens. It's disappeared by age 15 to 16. So you can immediately see that's how the U-shaped curve arose. Some things are disappearing, and other things are increasing. And the overall curve is completely meaningless, because we've got quite different patterns for different disorders. And here's a really interesting one, and I don't think anybody's really ever looked at this, really when panic attacks are starting. They're incredibly rare. Until really you get very late in adolescence. And then, as we can see, they're absolutely zooming up. We're currently doing the age 30, the kids at age 30, and it's interesting to see whether this rate of panic attacks is going to continue to increase. But what you'll notice here is that this pattern of increase is starting between 2 and 6 years later than the changes in depression and the other anxiety disorders. So for every one of these disorders, we've got a different developmental pattern. And so what that says to me is, if you've got different developmental patterns, the last thing you want to do is to put them all together into one big lump. Now, so one might think, given the timing of some of these things, that puberty might have something to do with it. At least I hope you might think that. But this slide is up here just to say to you that puberty is a very complex process. And adolescence is a very complex process. We've got these feedback loops. What starts out the GnRH pulse generator suddenly is allowed to switch on. We don't know exactly how, but it's under intense GABAergic suppression throughout all of childhood. You can have puberty any time in childhood if you switch this on. So, if you're 4 and that GABAergic suppression gets switched off, then you'll grow a beard. Well, I mean, the males will grow beards. And there are rare cases in which this actually. So we've got this whole system in place, which is just completely switched off. Then, for reasons we don't understand, it gets switched on. But we do know that you need your leptin system to be working, and you also need your kisspeptin system to be working. So isn't that nice? An adult thing, puberty is partly controlled by a kisspeptin system. And do you know why it's called kisspeptin? Do you think it has anything to do with the fact that it's associated with puberty? No. It has to do with the fact that the shape of the protein makes it look a bit like a Hershey's Kiss. It's sort of pointy at the top and bulbous at the bottom. Kiss peptin. But anyway, so this is just to say we've got a complicated story which we have been trying to pick apart a bit. And the first place we did it was in relation to depression. So we have a whole bunch of potential pubertal factors here. Age, Tanner stage, timing of puberty, 2 adrenal androgens, the trophic hormones, and then there's what are called the sex steroids, testosterone and estradiol. But we only did estradiol in the girls. And these data that I'm going to be presenting you cover the first 3 waves of data collection. So they go up to age 15. So we don't go all the way out to age 26. And then we've got a number of risk factors. We know, and these are deliberately the usual suspects. You know, we all know that depression and some anxiety disorders are related to bad things happening in your life, parental difficulties, all these sorts of mental health problems, extreme stresses, and parenting problems. So these are usual risk factors. And what we're looking for, because one of those bottom pathways, they said maybe it looks as if it's to do with puberty, but that's just because these things change in relation to, they're correlated with development along the pubertal axis. Maybe it's got nothing to do with the biology of puberty at all. And I thought I'd taken that one out, because I don't know what it's doing there. Well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, so in depression, what we found was that there was a big effect of testosterone and estradiol that explained all the age effect, all of the Tanner stage effect, all of everything in the differentiation between boys and girls occurring during puberty. But the interesting thing is that there's this interaction. Am I still working out here? So this stands for sex steroid level. It's just sort of, it's your total molar equivalent sum of testosterone and estradiol. And what you can see here is, these are basically childhood levels. Very little. And what you can see here is that these are maternal depression scores. That if you basically got very low sex steroids, there's no relationship between maternal depression score and the probability of being depressed as an adolescent. When you get into these are sort of middle pubertal ranges, you can see there's a quite substantial effect of maternal depression. And when you get up to adult levels, there's a really astonishingly strong association. So what does that suggest? It suggests to me that in fact what we've got here is that, and it's well known that the estradiol, testosterone, and transcription controlling factors, that what we're actually doing is either switching on or switching off some genes presumably somewhere in the brain. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean the environment isn't involved, but it doesn't seem to be responsible for the change in the depression of prevalence, for the change in the male-female relationship. So yes, life events still have a big effect on the probability of depression, but the odds ratio for that effect is exactly the same in children as it is in later adolescence. So it's not responsible for the change, even though it does appear to be potentially causal in precipitating depressive episodes. So if we then say, okay, what would we see in social phobia, which seems to be showing a rather similar pattern? What we find is, oh, well, it is associated with sex steroid levels in a similar way to the way it was with so the sex steroid level explains all the puberty part of the relationship, but it's also associated, in this case, with difficulties in parental relationships and poor parenting behavior. And there's no interaction between the sex steroid level and these other factors. But look at this. maternal depression was not significantly related. Remember, it was maternal depression was significantly related in relation to depression. So even though here we're seeing a similar age-related change, the things that it's associated with in social phobia only partially overlap with the factors that seem to be predictive in depression. So if we move on, so it doesn't matter what I call the pathway. So okay, we saw that GAD also shows a similar age effect, but it's not steroid dependent. It's driven by FSH and LH. Now, of course, these trophic hormones are what drive testosterone and estradiol, but there's differential end organ sensitivity, so you can pull apart if you get the age spread right, you can pull apart the separate effects of FSH and LH and the sex steroids, which are dependent on FSH and LH. And what this suggests, of course, is that it's the sex steroids in depression, but GAD, which overlaps massively with depression, it's not. These things are occurring at around the same time, but this suggests that there are different brain mechanisms involved. This is not steroid dependent, whereas the effect on depression was steroid dependent. So it seems like, okay, you've got correlated changes over time in different systems, which is what puberty is. You've got multiple systems which are showing correlated changes, but this is beginning to try and pull apart the different pieces. And if you've got different hormones that seem to be the primary drivers, that's indicating that the actual brain mechanism by which these changes are occurring has got to be different. So even something as, where there's a case for just putting major depression and GAD together, and actually you can make quite a good case for that on the genetic front and in all sorts of other ways. But, so on the other hand, some people really only have depression, and some people really only have anxiety. And okay, some people have a mix of both. So at the phenomenological level, they're not identical. So something must explain why some people experience misery and sadness, and some people experience fear and worry. So again, I don't want to lump GAD with depression, and I don't want to lump GAD with any of the other anxiety disorders, because they're showing different patterns of correlates with other disorders. We take separation anxiety disorder. It has nothing to do with any effects of adrenarche or puberty in either boys or girls. So in essence, the change was entirely accounted for by age, which means we have no idea what it's due to, because age is not interpretable. There's an famous old paper by Mike Rutter, just to say something I agree with, which is called something like age as an ambiguous variable. And age, of course, in developmental studies always is completely ambiguous. It's not a thing in itself. And so if you come up with age, then it means you know nothing. So I have to say about separation anxiety, we know nothing. All right. So I don't think I need to go ahead. I think that if that story isn't clear enough, then too bad. So Antje Bittner was a German postdoc who worked with us for several months a few years ago. And she was interested in prediction from childhood anxiety disorders to adolescent anxiety disorders. And we had enough people with SAD, GAD, OAD, and social phobia were common enough for analysis. Panic and agoraphobia in childhood were too rare for it to make any sense to us to see what they predicted. We controlled for all the other comorbidities, blah-de-blah-de-blah, because we're trying to get what's the specific contribution of this one disorder. And we controlled for all the other non-anxiety disorders as well. All right. So separation anxiety disorder in childhood only predicted to separation anxiety disorder in adolescence. Now, why have I got this not panic? It's because Don and Rochelle Klein suggested from a clinical population a number of years ago that SAD was the childhood version of panic disorder. And what I want to say to you here is this is not true. There are a couple of other clinical studies that suggested that as well, but there have now been three population-based studies, all of which have shown that this is not true. So it is an interesting question, though. Is it really true that people with panic disorder are just perfectly fine, all through their childhood and adolescence, they're perfectly fine, and then suddenly at age 19, they get panic disorder? There really was an expectation. That doesn't sound like, most other disorders of this sort. So it isn't panic. Social phobia, what we're seeing here is, these childhood anxiety disorders clearly are predicting later anxiety disorders. GAD is the odd one out because it's predicting conduct disorder, and it's not particularly in girls, and so it's not entirely clear to me what that means, but this is what we found. Over-anxious disorder predicts itself and panic disorder and depression, and there's this bit of CD as well, but it predicts panic disorder. So here is something that predicts panic. But does anybody remember OAD? Well, you do. OAD was abolished in DSM-4. It was invented in DSM-3. It continued in DSM-3R, and it was abolished. And if you've read your DSM-4 recently, it says. Tell you exactly what it says. It says diagnosis 300.02 GAD includes over-anxious disorder of childhood. So you all know this, because this is what you're adding up your symptoms in the clinic and putting it in your diagnostic formulation and whatever, but everybody's forgotten this. So you had to have 4 of the following for 6 months: multiple worries and concerns, somatic complaints, self-consciousness, excessive need for reinsurance, and tension. And the argument was that this was not a coherent enough set of items. It covered, worry about future events, somatic complaints, tension, it's a mishmash, which has always seemed to me to be the stupidest argument in the world. Why should, take major depressive disorder. It's got sleep, it's got appetite, it's got suicide, it's got sadness and anhedonia. The only conceptual thing that links those together is that they occur together in real patients in the real world and constitute a definable and treatable entity. And so it's not logically incoherent, it's what occurs clinically in the world. And of course, when they made up the DSM-3, they had people, clinicians, who saw kids. What an amazing idea. And you all see these kids. It's just you don't add up their symptoms in this way anymore. So we've abolished it. And we've replaced it with this, which, as you can see, is symptomatically really very different. The amount of symptom overlap between those two categories is not very great. But GAD is supposed to include over-anxious disorder of childhood. Does it? Answer, no. So of all the people who've got either GAD or OAD, only 17% have both. We've got 31% have only GAD, and more than half of them only meet criteria for OAD. So the answer is GAD does not really include OAD. It's a different, and this level of comorbidity is massively less the amount of comorbidity between GAD and depression. So go figure. Well, maybe they've got other anxiety disorders. Maybe they've got other disorders, so if any other anxiety disorders. And the answer is what you still see is that, that of all the people with any anxiety disorder, only 11% of them would have met criteria. Only 11% of them would have been picked up if you hadn't had the OAD diagnosis. So what happens to the rates of OAD? Well, it shows this rather similar pattern, except it goes up a bit later, and I just do not even want to think of that's the other dot on my graphs I want to go away. So when they're 30, I hope it's sort of back up here again. What you can see is OAD is showing something of a similar pattern, but it's occurring 2 years later than the increase that you see with either GAD or with depression. So what if we do prediction from childhood and adolescent anxiety disorders to young adult disorders? And this is Bill Copeland's work. So adolescent GAD actually, weirdly, in females protects you from later GAD, but it predicts depression. So, and we're expecting it, we would expect it to predict depression. So in this particular analysis, it is actually sort of looking like an early form of depression. But we know from other analyses that those lines go in both directions. So adolescent OAD predicts, oh, well, panic in young adults. So childhood SAD predicts agoraphobia, which is maybe not too horribly surprising. And GAD protects you from panic, but is associated with agoraphobia again. So that also maybe is not terribly surprising. Childhood, so now we're predicting from childhood all the way into young adulthood, missing out adolescence. And OAD predicts panic. So however we look at it, across whatever time span, over-anxious disorder is predicting panic disorder. And separation anxiety disorder never, ever does. So I wonder whether we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater when we switched from DSM-3R to DSM-4, and that we've actually missed the pattern of childhood psychopathology that really is associated with the later onset of panic disorder. And it seems to me that's a pretty important thing to have screwed up, because as we all know, panic disorder is an extremely disabling and really quite common disorder in adulthood. And it's really quite important to think about, if we can trace back its origins, then maybe we can do something about improving that situation. But we've been looking all this time in completely the wrong place, and we've thrown out of our diagnostic system the one thing that seems to be genuinely predictive. And so, the end. Thank you very much. Well, I've sensibly left you only 2 minutes for questions. Ha ha. Hello. How are you doing?
I don't have much of a voice.
I hadn't noticed you sitting back there.
Yeah, I don't have much of a voice. But I'm wondering, just leaving on this note that you're leaving us on, I am wondering what is going to happen with the new DSM in terms of going back to some of these over-anxious anxiety, those kind of features, because I feel like it leaves us with a very weird way of diagnosing anxiety in children. I think the way the DSM as it currently is now. I
agree with you. It also included, there aren't any adult psychiatrists. Any adult psychiatrists here remember how many of those symptoms do you need? You need 5, don't you, for GAD, but you need 3 in childhood. That cutoff was based on 0 evidence There was no evidence before it was introduced. There's been no evidence that that was the right thing to do since it was introduced. I think this study, these two studies are the first studies to have even looked at anything to do with OAD since the change was made. I mean, so we can see that both clinically and on the research front, changing these criteria makes a significant difference to what the research effort will be. But I would say we have given these data to the committee, and it seems to me that given the way the whole DSM-5 process has been working out, it will make absolutely no difference whatsoever. And we'll carry on. I have no idea what the anxiety group's going to come out with. I understand that there now has been final approval of whatever the final thing is going to be, and it is going to be published on time, but now people are complaining about how that process works, because you have all these committees working for years of experts, and then you have a superior set of committees of essentially non-experts in the area deciding whether they agree with that or not. So, but what I would say is clinically, there's nothing to stop us all going back, reminding ourselves what the criteria for OAD used to be, and giving them the diagnosis of whatever you like. But there's nothing to stop us clinically from saying, oh, let's start looking for that pattern. And if we do, then let's be thinking in our minds, okay, these are the kids who are at risk for panic disorder. And so being very sensitive to, as they get older, to whether they really do start having panic attacks or not. I mean, so, I don't know if any of you read the sort of last blast of Alan Francis, where he just basically says, I suggest that you just don't use it. Just refuse. Just don't even buy the book. Just do what you think is right. I wouldn't say I'm going to go quite as far as that, but, And sorry, did that get to your question? Oh, can I just say one other very interesting thing, is that in our preschool sample, the rate of OA, none of them meet criteria for over-anxious disorder. So it seems like and it may be because it's difficult to identify in children all this worry type of stuff. And so there is that interesting question about what, if we go even earlier, what's going to predict over-anxious disorder later, and we don't have the data on that.
Would you go back to your 3 pictures on the brain?
Oh, no. Nope, sorry. Impossible. I should say, by the way, that you are only the second group of people who've ever seen these pictures. They are...
We want the one on the pathways, by the way.
You want that one too?
Yeah, but I want you to go back to the brain, but we do want that picture.
Well, you can't have them both together.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
brain.
there it is.
There's the brain.
So I have a question. So the cuts are slightly different.
Yes.
And so when you go to 3, it looks like there's more activation. Is that the basal ganglia, the bottom sort of horizontal
This bit
blue?
here.
Yeah, what is that infiltrating into?
Yes, it is. In fact, what this is it's all depends on what slice you take. There's actually, as you go through it, across the slices, it's actually this sort of big mass all across here.
So if you...
And I mean, the other thing to say is we're talking about dorsolateral here, whereas in these two, we're talking about ventral prefrontal.
But apart from the prefrontal cortex, I guess my, in the back of my mind is the question of, if you take other cuts for the first 2 pictures,
Yes.
do you still get that infiltration into the basal ganglia?
I can't honestly tell you that.
I mean, one could really make an argument, if one really wants to get carried away in fantasy land, that separation anxiety is a more primitive sort of disorder. Anne's laughing. I can hear her already, sort of. She knows she's influenced my thinking. So it's a more primitive sort of disorder and fades out into adolescence and adulthood. And you wonder, because the basal ganglia is a more primitive part of the brain, if that's something that
Something
you're
to
seeing
do with
here.
that,
Just food for thought. I just wondered.
Yeah, and I can't answer that. What I do know is that this is how it appears in this slice, but in fact, it's really, if you go to other slices, it's involving this whole sort of enormous piece here, which, actually does make you think, well, would kind of fit with that argument here, that actually this is a very, this is a very big region of brain. This has got to be involving a lot of different systems, spreading different slices all through here. So, whether I never thought of SAD being more primitive.
Well, it's normative when they're 8 months of age, and then it's sort of
Oh, sorry, I think you were first.
I had a question about early onset puberty. I was wondering if anyone had looked at subgroups that have earlier onset puberty, like African American girls, to see if their prevalence curve looks different from the rest of the population.
That is a really interesting question. There isn't any question that early onset of puberty is associated with higher rates of depression and a variety of other behavioral disorders as well. I mean, there's a huge study, like 37,000 kids from Finland, which shows this very clearly. I haven't emphasized it here, but our data show that as well. And there's a big literature on that. And it's typically been that is the case in, this is in girls. And it used to be that it seems as though early puberty were protective in boys, but the more recent literature really shows the opposite. And I've got some little theories about why that is, but it doesn't quite address your problem. The question is, what aspect of puberty would you be looking at? Because if you take Tanner stage, you've got maybe, African American girls are sort of getting rated at 6 to 9 months earlier than Caucasian girls. But if you take onset of menarche, the difference is very small. And so in relation to, maybe it's a month or two if it's anything. And so that, and given that what we find is that all of the effect of Tanner stage is explained by the hormones, then you wouldn't expect to see, from that perspective, you wouldn't expect to see much in the way of black-white differences in terms of timing of the onset of the change. And in fact, insofar as we can do that, in our sample in the smokers, we've only got like 100 African American people. But if we look at them, we see exactly the same pattern as them as we do in the Caucasians. It's that whole issue of timing of puberty is a much more complex one than it's usually presented as.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. That was wonderful.
Thank
I'm
you.
backtracking a little bit. I want to go back to this slide.
Which one?
To this one right here.
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you're surprised to find differentiation this early on, and whether we're putting too much weight and emphasis on this, since the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped at this point and continues to develop until your 20s.
Yeah. Well, we did this study precisely because we believed that. So there's a couple of things to say. As far as we're aware, this is the first study that has controlled, has treated these 3 anxiety disorders as separate disorders and controlled for the presence of the other disorders when it's doing these analyses. So this in generalized anxiety controls for effects of social phobia and separation anxiety. I don't think there has been no other imaging study that's done that. So okay, there may be a study of GAD, but it hasn't ever accounted for the fact that a lot of people with GAD also has social phobia and separation anxiety. So the whole purpose of doing this study was we had the idea that we don't believe that these should all be lumped together. And therefore, there's reason to suppose that there were, and from the adult literature too, there's reason to suppose there is a distinction between, angry faces in social phobia and fearful faces in generalized anxiety disorder, suggesting that you're recruiting actually somewhat different fear systems. So our initial hypothesis was that we would see differences. So yippee!
Do you think these patterns would persist over time, given that there's still going to be so much development?
Well, they fit in not too badly with some of the changes you see reported in adulthood. So we're not talking about, this is exactly where we, why are we looking at amygdala ventromedial prefrontal cortex? Why would we focus on that? We focus on that because the adult literature would tell us that for GAD and depression, this sort of finding is the sort of finding that you would expect. So what we're saying here is, well, here they are as markers, and in terms of persistence, the answer has to be yes, because this is already persistent. This was kids who had GAD 2 to 4 years ago, and this is controlling for their current symptoms. So this is, as it were, a marker of having had it before. So it's already persistent. Time for bed, said Zebedee. That was an English TV joke, but I don't suppose anybody knows what I meant by that.